Clayton Ward rose with the sun, as he always did, though the light no longer stirred anything inside him. The soft golden rays that stretched across the plains and filtered through his bedroom window felt more like a reminder than a beginning. Another day. Another echo of yesterday. The air was dry, coated with the scent of hay, sweat, and distant dust. His boots hit the floorboards with a heavy thud, the kind that echoed in an empty house like a closing door. He moved with purpose but no enthusiasm, brushing his fingers across the brim of his hat before settling it on his head. The hat had belonged to his father, now worn and bent at the edges, much like Clayton himself. Out in the barn, the cattle lowed lazily. He moved among them like a ghost, checking water troughs, feeding, noting which ones were ready for sale. The animals didn't speak, didn't judge, didn't remind him of anything. That was what he liked most about them. He saddled his mare, Juniper, and rode out across the ranch's perimeter, the landscape endless in its loneliness. Golden grasses stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional mesquite bush or wind-worn fence post. Clayton rode with a stiff back and eyes that didn't linger. He didn't see beauty anymore, only boundaries. This land had been in the Ward family for generations, but it had never felt emptier. The ranch house, sturdy and well-kept, stood like a monument to a life that once held promise. Inside, the rooms remained mostly untouched. The nursery door upstairs was always closed. Dust gathered on the windowsills. No laughter echoed through the halls, not since Eleanor. He didn't let himself say her name often. Didn't like the way it scraped his throat like broken glass. He remembered that day like it was branded into his skin. Eleanor had gone into labor early, the baby kicking too hard, too fast. The doctor came late, the rain fell heavy, and the nearest hospital was hours away. By the time help arrived, it was just a still little girl in a blanket and a lifeless mother with blue lips. Clayton had screamed that night, not aloud, but inside, where it rattled around and never left. He buried them under the cottonwood tree at the edge of the ranch, the same tree where he'd proposed to her under a blood-orange sky. After that, Clayton stopped going to church, stopped answering letters, stopped inviting neighbors over for supper. People came around at first, knocking softly on the door, leaving pies and well wishes on the porch. He let the crows pick at them. Years passed. The world moved on. Clayton did not. This morning, like so many others, he loaded a trailer with a few head of cattle, tied it to his old truck, and started the long drive into town. The sun beat down hard, and the road shimmered ahead, cracked and dry. The truck's radio was dead. Not that he'd turn it on, even if it worked. Music just reminded him of dancing with Eleanor in the kitchen barefoot on Sunday mornings. By the time he reached the edge of town, it was already bustling. Market day. Clayton hated market day. Too many voices, too much laughter. People smiling like the world wasn't falling apart all the time. He pulled into a familiar lot near the stockyard, where men in dusty hats and leather boots haggled over cattle like they were trading cards. He kept his conversations brief. Numbers, weights, ages, cold, transactional. That's how he liked it. But something different caught his eye that day. Near the edge of the marketplace, where the gravel met the dry grass, a small crowd had gathered. There wasn't the usual raucous laughter or bargaining. The tone was hushed, strange, like folks weren't sure if they were allowed to be there. Clayton might have ignored it, might have gone back to the truck and driven home. But something, curiosity, or maybe the ghost of compassion, nudged him closer. That's when he saw her. A girl, no, a young woman, maybe 20, stood barefoot in the dirt, her belly round with child, her eyes wide and wet. Her hands were tied loosely in front of her with a fraying length of cloth. Her hair, long and tangled, blew across her face with the wind, but she didn't flinch. She just stood there, trembling, as an older woman beside her barked at the crowd. "She can cook, clean, knows how to care for babies," the older woman declared, her voice sharp as barbed wire. "She'll birth soon, and she don't ask questions." Clayton's stomach turned. "Who the hell's selling a person in broad daylight?" someone muttered behind him. Her own mother, another whispered, said the girl's a burden. Ain't got no man to take care of her, says she's doing what's best. Clayton looked at the girl again. She had tears on her cheeks, but she didn't cry. Not loud, not in protest. It was like she'd accepted something most folks would never dream of, being traded like livestock. Bile rose in his throat. Men around him shifted, some with pity, others with a predator's glint in their eyes. One started to speak, some crude offer, but was cut off when Clayton heard his own voice. $100. It startled even him. Heads turned. The girl's mother blinked. What? 100, Clayton said again, stepping forward. I'll take her. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The mother hesitated, eyes flicking to the others. That all you got, cowboy? Clayton pulled a crumpled wad of bills from his coat and threw it at her feet. That's all I got, and it's more than she'll ever get from these jackals. There was a beat of silence. Deal, the woman spat, snatching the money. She didn't look at the girl, didn't say goodbye, just walked off into the crowd like she'd tossed away a sack of flour. Clayton turned to the girl. She looked up at him, wary, her lip trembling. He reached down and sliced the cloth from her wrist with his pocket knife, careful not to touch her. She rubbed her wrist slowly, not saying a word. I ain't gonna hurt you, he muttered, voice low and gravelly. You got a name? She nodded faintly. Lydia. All right, Lydia, he said, more to himself than to her. Come on, let's go. The walk to the truck was silent. People stared but didn't speak. Clayton opened the passenger door and helped her in, as gently as he knew how. She didn't look him in the eye. They drove for hours, the silence stretching like a taut wire between them. Lydia kept one hand on her belly, the other clutching the worn hem of her dress. Her eyes were locked on the road ahead, but they didn't see it. Clayton gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered. He didn't know what he'd done, what impulse had grabbed hold of him. All he knew was that the image of that girl, tied up, pregnant, and being offered to the highest bidder, would have haunted him more than any ghost. When they reached the ranch, dusk was falling. The sky blazed orange and purple, casting long shadows across the porch. Clayton pulled up, cut the engine, and stepped out. Lydia didn't move until he walked around and opened the door. This is my place, he said quietly. Ain't much, but it's clean and safe. She stepped out slowly, her legs stiff, her face unreadable. He led her inside, past the kitchen, down the hall to a small guest room. He flicked on the lamp. The bed was made, the window cracked for fresh air. You can stay here, bathroom's down the hall. I'll be up early to check the herd. You're not expected to work. You're safe here. She didn't answer, just looked around like a stranger in a museum. Clayton turned to leave, then paused. There's food in the fridge. If you need anything, just knock. He left her alone and went to his own room, where he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, staring at his hands. They were shaking. In the room next door, Lydia sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at nothing. She didn't cry. She was past crying. But as the wind howled softly outside and the moon climbed over the horizon, both of them, strangers bound by a moment neither could explain, felt the quiet shift of something they couldn't name. Not peace. Not yet. But the first breath of something different. Maybe even the beginning of hope. The first morning came with no sound of alarm clocks, no human voices, only the low murmurs of cattle in the pasture and the soft creak of the old wooden house warming under the sun. Clayton had been up since before dawn, as usual. Lydia, however, remained in her room with the door shut, wrapped in the cocoon of uncertainty that filled every corner of her life. She didn't sleep much. The bed was too clean, too quiet. She was used to noise, to chaos, to people always shouting, footsteps stomping, the shuffle of her mother's cards, and the hiss of cruel words. This silence felt heavier than all of it, but not unsafe, just unfamiliar. Clayton didn't knock. He never did. He left a clean towel and a glass of water on a small wooden table outside her door, then walked out to the barn to begin his day. He didn't expect conversation, didn't expect gratitude. He expected nothing, because asking for something meant depending, and he had long ago trained himself not to depend on anyone, not even on fate. Lydia emerged near midday, wearing the same dress she had arrived in. She moved slowly, one hand on her back, the other pressing into her stomach as if constantly reminded of the growing life inside her. Her eyes darted around, scanning the house. It smelled like pine soap and coffee, nothing else. The table in the kitchen held a half-eaten biscuit, a cooling cup of black coffee, and a jar of honey that hadn't been opened in months. She didn't touch any of it. She wandered to the sink, ran her hand under cold water and flinched. She wasn't used to running water, not like this, not in a place that didn't charge you for every second. Outside, Clayton was hammering new boards into the fence by the pasture. She stood at the doorway and watched him for a long time. He didn't notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't say anything. The wind tugged gently at her hair. She didn't step outside, not yet. By evening, she had settled into a routine of sitting near the window, curled in a chair with a blanket over her knees, staring out at the open field. The land was endless. That frightened her more than the walls ever had. How could someone live with so much sky around them and not go mad? When Clayton finally came in, his boots heavy with dried mud, he glanced in her direction and gave a simple nod. She returned it, barely. He walked past her to the stove, removed the lid from a pot of beans, and stirred them with a wooden spoon. He didn't speak, neither did she. He placed 2 bowls on the table, slid one in her direction, then sat and ate without ceremony. After a few minutes, she took the seat opposite him. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the spoon. Her stomach growled, loud enough that she flushed. He didn't react. She took a bite, then another. It was bland, but warm, more than she'd had in days. "You'll need more iron," he said, voice low. She looked up. "For the baby," he added. "Beans'll help, but I can pick up greens next time I'm in town." She nodded. I can cook." He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to. I want to. If I'm staying, you're staying." Those words landed like a stone in her chest. Not a threat, not a command, just a fact. She didn't know how to thank him. The words felt too small, too fragile for what this place already meant, even after just one day. So she didn't try, she just kept eating. That night, after the dishes were washed and dried in silence, Lydia sat outside on the front steps, arms wrapped around her knees. The stars above were more than she'd ever seen in her life. She whispered the baby's name, though she hadn't chosen one yet, into the night sky. Maybe she didn't believe in anything, not anymore. But if she could speak it into the stars, maybe that child would come into the world, knowing someone had waited for her. Inside, Clayton sat in the dark living room, staring at the old photo on the mantel. Eleanor smiled at him from another lifetime, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other reaching for his. He hadn't touched the frame in years. Tonight, he did. Days passed. Then weeks. Lydia found herself rising earlier, sometimes before Clayton even left the house. She started cleaning, not because he asked, but because it felt like something she could control. She mended an old tablecloth, swept the floor, organized the pantry. The nursery door upstairs remained shut. She never touched it. Some lines didn't need to be crossed. She helped feed the horses, gathered eggs from the hens, and even brushed down Juniper after Clayton had returned from his morning ride. He didn't say much, just gave a nod of acknowledgement, but there was something else in his eyes now, less guarded, more steady. One morning, as she stood in the kitchen peeling potatoes, Clayton approached her with a hesitant expression. "I was thinking," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "You might want a few things from town, new clothes, anything you need." She looked down at her dress, now stained and threadbare. "I don't have money." "I didn't ask if you did." She hesitated. "Would you mind if I came with you?" He blinked, then slowly nodded. "If that's what you want." When they got to town, people stared. Not at him. They always knew Clayton as the man who kept to himself, the rancher with the ghost wife. But Lydia, young, pregnant, quiet, walking beside him in a borrowed coat and work boots, sparked whispered curiosity. Clayton kept her close, not possessive, but protective. They walked through the general store, picking up soap, fabric, new shoes, canned peaches, and a soft quilt Lydia fell in love with the moment she touched it. He bought it without asking. She didn't argue. Outside, they passed the saloon. From within, a drunken voice barked, "Hey, cowboy, what's the going rate for used goods these days?" Clayton stopped. Lydia froze. He turned slowly toward the voice, eyes narrowed like a storm gathering behind them. "I'd think real hard about your next words," he said, voice like steel. The man inside raised his hands, smirking but said no more. They walked on. Back at the ranch, Lydia unpacked their haul in the kitchen. She moved with quiet joy, folding the quilt and pressing it to her face. It smelled like cedar and cotton. Clayton watched her from the hallway, something shifting behind his eyes. Not desire, not yet, but something warmer than detachment. That night, she made stew with beef and carrots, biscuits from scratch. They ate together at the table, not as strangers, but as people slowly discovering each other. "I could teach you to ride," he said suddenly. She looked up. "Horses. Might do you good to get out a bit." "I'd like that," she whispered. He nodded. "Tomorrow, then." Their first lesson was clumsy. Lydia was terrified of falling. Clayton held the reins steady and guided Juniper, while Lydia clung to the saddle like a life raft. But he was patient. He walked beside her the entire time, explaining how to feel the horse's movement, how to shift her weight. By the end of the ride, she was laughing. Loud, unrestrained, the sound ringing across the pasture like wind chimes. He smiled, just barely, but it stayed longer than any smile he'd worn in years. The days blurred into each other, each one softer than the last. She began to talk more. He listened. She told him about the house she grew up in, a moldy trailer on the edge of a parking lot behind a casino, about her mother's boyfriends, all of them worse than the last, about her father, who disappeared when she was 7, and about the man who gave her the baby. She didn't name him, said it wasn't worth it, but her face changed when she spoke of him. Not just pain, but betrayal. Clayton never pried, but he did listen. In turn, he shared stories about Eleanor, how they met in church, how she used to sing off-key just to make him laugh, how she wanted 6 children, how she only ever got to hold one. One night, as they sat on the porch and watched lightning flicker far in the distance, Lydia asked, "Do you think we get more than one chance?" "At what?" "Family, love, starting over." Clayton didn't answer right away. "I think," he said slowly, "we get what we're willing to fight for. And maybe, if we're lucky, what we're willing to forgive." She looked at him, eyes glassy. "You think I deserve that?" "I think you already earned it." Her lip trembled. She turned away so he wouldn't see. Inside, the baby kicked, hard. She winced, pressing both hands to her belly. Clayton stepped closer, almost unsure. "Can I?" he asked. She nodded. He placed his rough hand on the curve of her stomach, just in time to feel a sharp little jab. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "That one's got a mean hook," he said. "She's gonna be strong," Lydia replied. He looked at her, not the bump, not the baby, her. She already is. In that moment, something passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but real. Like 2 broken edges beginning to find a shape again. The house no longer felt quite so hollow. The silence, less oppressive. And for the first time in years, Clayton left the nursery door upstairs just slightly ajar. The first frost came early that year. Crisp, white frost dusted the fence rails and turned the pasture to a glimmering field of silver under the sunrise. Lydia stood at the porch, railing with a blanket around her shoulders and a steaming cup of weak tea between her hands. watching the horizon light up in pink and amber. The baby shifted low in her belly now, restless, like she too was waiting for something. Lydia spoke to her sometimes when Clayton wasn't around, in whispers, telling her about the trees, the horses, the sunrise, the wind. She didn't know what kind of world she was preparing the child for, but she tried to fill her with peace. Clayton came out of the barn, brushing hay off his jacket, and glanced her way. She gave him a small smile, one of the easier ones these days. He didn't return it, but his eyes lingered longer than they used to. That was his way. He rarely smiled, but when he did, it was earned. That afternoon, as she was folding linens and tucking them into the chest near the stairs, she paused and looked at the closed door to the nursery. She had never been told to avoid it. Clayton had never given her rules, but she'd always sensed the boundary. Today, though, with her hands still on the soft cotton blanket, she turned the knob and pushed it open. The room smelled of cedar and dust, untouched for years. A crib stood in one corner, hand-carved, beautiful. A rocking chair beside it, worn smooth at the arms. The wallpaper had small, faded stars on it, blue and pale yellow, with one wall painted a muted sky blue. She stepped in slowly, reverently. There was no sadness in the room, only stillness, the kind of stillness that holds a memory in perfect suspension. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She only stood in the middle of the room and breathed in the quiet. Then she sat in the rocker and placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked, and Lydia smiled, a small, private smile. She stayed there for a long while, and when Clayton walked by the open door later, he said nothing. But he didn't close it. As the days passed, they spoke more freely. Lydia told him about her childhood in a trailer park outside Albuquerque, about how her mother always talked about escape but never went further than the local bar. She told him about the night she realized she was pregnant, and the terror that gripped her when her mother found out. There were no accusations from Clayton, no advice. He listened with his hands folded and his gaze steady, and Clayton, too, let pieces of his past unravel from the tightly wound cord he'd bound them in. He told her about Eleanor in small doses, her laugh, the way she always hummed when nervous, how she wanted to name their daughter June. His voice cracked only once, when he described the morning he woke to silence in a cold crib. Lydia didn't reach out to touch him. She knew too well that kind of grief doesn't need to be soothed. It needs to be witnessed. They grew into something more than comfort, not lovers, not yet, but tethered by an understanding few others could grasp. One night, the wind screamed against the windows, rattling them in their frames. Lydia was in bed, but the baby wouldn't let her sleep. She paced the room, her feet swollen, her back aching, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name. After an hour, she wrapped herself in her coat and stepped out to the porch. Clayton was already there, seated on the steps, smoking a rare cigarette, the tip glowing faintly like a firefly in the dark. "Can't sleep?" he asked without turning. "The baby thinks it's rodeo time," she said, easing herself down beside him. "And the wind's worse than usual." "She'll be stubborn," he said with a hint of dry humor, "just like her mama." Lydia let out a quiet laugh. "I wasn't always this way. I used to be quieter, smaller." He didn't reply. She added, "You think it's possible to change who we are? Not just cover it up. Really change?" Clayton took a long drag, then exhaled smoke into the cold night. "I think pain changes us, whether we want it to or not. And maybe, if we're lucky, it makes space for something better." She looked at him for a long moment. "You still smoke?" "Only when I think too much." "About Eleanor?" He didn't look at her, but his answer was soft. "And now, you." The wind shifted, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She didn't respond, couldn't find the right words. They sat like that until the sun hinted at the edge of the sky. A few days later, Lydia went to the barn and found Clayton repairing the old wagon wheel. He was sweaty, shirt sleeves rolled, hands covered in grease. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him for a moment, before clearing her throat. "I want to do something," she said. He looked up. "For the baby, something that's mine. I was thinking, Maybe I could paint the nursery, make it feel different. He nodded slowly. You don't have to ask permission. I'm not asking, she said gently. I'm asking for help. Clayton set down the wrench, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked with her to town that afternoon. They picked out pale greens and soft yellows, brushes, and a new rocking chair cushion. On the drive home, she talked about what kind of person she hoped her daughter would be. Strong, yes, but also kind. Curious, brave. Clayton listened, one hand on the wheel, the other resting loosely on the open window. That night, they began painting. Together. Clayton moved the furniture, Lydia painted the lower walls. They laughed when her belly smudged against the wet paint. When they finished the first coat, she collapsed into the chair and sighed. It's real now, she whispered. It was always real, he said. Later, she woke to cramps, sharp, persistent, coiling pain. Her breath hitched. She sat up, pressed her hand to her side, and waited. It passed. Then came back, stronger. She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. She called out. Clayton was at her door in seconds. I think, she gasped. Something's wrong. He helped her down to the couch, fetched a damp cloth, tried to remain calm. The clock read 3:14 a.m. He tried the phone. Dead. The line was down. Storms had rolled in hard after dark. The road out was slick, likely washed over. The doctor wouldn't make it in time. Panic clawed at his chest. The memory of Eleanor bleeding out in his arms slammed into him like a freight train. But this was different. It had to be. He knelt beside her, held her hand. I'm here, he said, voice tight. I'm not going anywhere. The hours blurred. The pain intensified, Lydia cried out. Clayton paced, fetched water, lit every lamp in the house, boiled towels, remembered everything he'd read and everything he'd been too afraid to recall. When the baby came, it wasn't like the movies. It was raw, primal, terrifying. Lydia screamed, and Clayton sobbed silently, praying to a god he'd cursed for years. He caught the baby, wrapped her in a clean cloth, and held her close. She was crying. She was breathing. But Lydia wasn't. Lydia? He whispered, shaking her shoulder. Her eyes fluttered, her skin pale. No, no, no. Stay with me. Stay here. She blinked, took a ragged breath, reached for him, and smiled. Clayton sank to the floor, the baby cradled in his arms, Lydia's hand in his. His whole body shook. Relief, joy, grief, all at once. Her name, Lydia whispered, voice hoarse. What? Grace, she said, and he nodded. It was the only name that made sense. Morning came with golden light spilling into the living room. The storm had passed. Lydia slept on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her face peaceful. Clayton sat beside her, rocking gently, baby Grace in his arms. He looked down at the tiny face, pink and perfect, and for the first time in years, tears streamed down his cheeks, not from pain, but from something he thought had died with Eleanor, hope. The morning sun stretched lazily over the hills, casting golden shadows through the ranch house windows. It was quiet, but not the kind of hollow silence that had once filled these walls. This was the hush of something sacred. Lydia slept curled around a pillow on the couch, her breath slow, her body still drained from the long night. A nearby wood stove radiated warmth, crackling softly. Beside it, in the old rocking chair by the window, Clayton cradled Grace. He didn't rock the chair. He just held her, both hands carefully supporting her tiny frame as though she were made of porcelain. Her skin was flushed, her lips pursed as if still dreaming. She had a thin crop of dark hair, and when she moved, it was with the slow curiosity of new life. Clayton couldn't stop looking at her. There were no words. Just the rhythm of her breathing and the weight of something immeasurable pressing into his chest. His arms ached, not from fatigue, but from the strange sensation of holding a future. The sun had risen high when Lydia finally stirred. She didn't call out. She just turned her head slowly and found Clayton watching her. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. He stood without a word and walked over, kneeling beside her. He placed Grace gently into her arms, and Lydia held the child as if she'd never let go again. Her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, not from fear, but from something deeper. They stayed like that for a long time. No explanations, no plans. Just a new mother, a quiet man, and the child who had changed everything. Clayton fixed her something to eat. Warm oatmeal with honey, soft bread, and boiled eggs. She barely finished half the plate before exhaustion pulled her back under. He tucked a blanket over her, placed Grace in the makeshift cradle beside the couch, and sat again in the rocking chair. The wind outside had calmed. The storm had passed in more ways than one. Over the next days, they existed inside a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Clayton made meals. Lydia nursed Grace and rested. They didn't leave the house. Didn't need to. The outside world felt too loud for something so tender. Grace cried softly, fussed when hungry, but never screamed. She fit into the house like she'd always been there. Lydia moved slower now, careful with every step, but there was light in her face that hadn't been there before. She smiled at Grace often, even when the baby slept. And Clayton, though he never said it aloud, began to smile more too. Not wide, not often, but when he looked at that child, something soft and old flickered in his eyes. One afternoon, as Lydia stood by the window holding Grace to her chest, she glanced at the open door to the nursery. It had remained unchanged since the day they'd painted it. Lydia walked in, humming something tuneless. She swayed gently, rocking Grace as she stepped to the crib. She paused. "Do you think we should move her in here soon?" she asked. Clayton stood in the doorway. He didn't answer right away. "Maybe in a week or two," he said, "if you feel ready." She nodded. Clayton walked in slowly and touched the side of the crib. He traced the wood with his fingers, then looked at Lydia. "This was hers," he said. "Eleanor built it with me. We never even got to put her down in it." Lydia blinked, lips parting. "I didn't know you built it." "Every nail!" She stepped closer. "We can keep her in our room for now. But I'd like her to grow up knowing this room wasn't always empty." He looked at her. She wasn't asking for permission. She was including him. He gave a small nod, then turned to leave. "Clayton?" she called after him. He paused. "Thank you for not giving up on her. Or me." He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to hear his voice. "You gave me a reason not to." The next week brought visitors. The sheriff rode up the long dirt path one morning, hat in hand, boots dusty. Clayton met him at the porch. "Just checking in," the sheriff said, nodding toward the house. "Heard about the storm. You all right?" Clayton nodded. "We're fine." "Miss Lydia?" "She's resting." The sheriff hesitated. "There's been some talk in town about where the girl came from. Some folks asking questions." "I paid for her," Clayton said flatly. "I ain't here to arrest you, Ward. I know you, and I figure there's more to that story." "There is, but it ain't one that needs telling." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You keep her safe. That baby too. You need anything, you know where to find me." When he left, Clayton stood on the porch a long time, watching the dust settle behind the horse. That night, as they sat by the fire, Lydia asked, "Did something happen?" Clayton looked into the flames. "Town's talking. They will for a while." "Do you regret it?" she asked. He turned to her. "No." She looked down at Grace, now swaddled in a handmade blanket, asleep in her arms. "Neither do I." They began building something together, quietly, piece by piece. Lydia started tending the garden again, kneeling carefully between rows of herbs and small tomato vines. Clayton repaired the chicken coop and fixed the barn door. They worked without much talk, but with rhythm. Their movements fell into sync. In the evenings, they'd sit on the porch, Grace between them, and share memories in half-formed sentences, the way people do when the past is too heavy to name all at once. Then came the letter. It arrived in a crumpled envelope, no return address, just Lydia's name scrawled in sharp handwriting, She didn't open it at first, just stared at it, held it in her lap while rocking Grace. Clayton found her like that and sat down beside her. "You gonna read it?" "It's from her," Lydia said. "I can feel it." "You don't have to read it." "I know." But she did. The letter was short, no apologies, no regret. Just a statement that her mother was sick, bedridden, and wanted to meet the baby before she died. There were no promises, just manipulation wrapped in a plea. Lydia folded the letter and stared into the fireplace for a long time. "She doesn't get to have this," she whispered. Clayton said nothing, just reached over and placed a hand on her knee. "I'm not angry," she said after a while. "I thought I would be, but I'm not. I just feel nothing." "That's something," he said. She stood, walked to the fire, and tossed the letter in. It curled and blackened, the flames swallowing every word. Later that night, as Grace slept, Lydia looked at Clayton and asked something that had lingered between them for weeks. "What happens now?" He raised his eyes from the floor and met hers. "What do you want to happen?" "I want her to have a name, a home, a father." He didn't move. "I want us to be a family," she said. Clayton's hands were shaking. He didn't realize it at first. "I never thought. After Eleanor. I didn't think I could." "You already are." She stepped closer. "I'm not asking for romance. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I want you in her life. I want you in mine." Clayton stood. He took her hand, gently, carefully. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "But I'll learn. I'll try. That's all I've ever needed." In the quiet after, they stood by Grace's crib and watched her sleep. A storm had broken something inside both of them, and in the wreckage, something new had taken root. Not just survival, but family. The seasons shifted with slow patience. Winter rolled through in gusts of white and ice that bit at the windows, but inside the ranch house, warmth had found a way to linger. Not just from the crackling hearth or the thick wool blankets draped across the furniture, but in the quiet routines, the shared looks, and the steady heartbeat of something unspoken growing between them. Lydia had recovered, and then she had flourished. Her cheeks regained their color, her steps found strength, and her eyes, once dull from despair, now lit up whenever Grace laughed. And Grace, small as she still was, became the very center of everything. She was loud when she was happy, louder when she wasn't, and curious about everything. Her tiny fists reached for everything within sight, and her cries could command the attention of the whole house. Clayton adapted more slowly. He was never meant to be a father again, not in his own mind. But Grace didn't give him a choice. She took to him as if by instinct, always reaching for his beard with stubby fingers, giggling when he made his gravel-deep rumble of a laugh, nuzzling against his chest when he held her after long days. There was a night when she wouldn't stop crying, when Lydia was too exhausted to move. Clayton took Grace in his arms, bounced her gently near the window, and started to hum. He didn't even know he remembered the melody. It was an old lullaby, something his mother used to sing when he was small. As he hummed and rocked, Grace blinked slowly, then fell asleep, cheek pressed against his shirt. Lydia, watching from the hallway, felt her chest ache, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming fullness of what this man had become. They didn't speak of love, not directly. It lived in the way Clayton brushed Lydia's hair from her face when she nodded off at the kitchen table. It was in the way she repaired the elbow of his favorite flannel shirt, sewing in silence while he chopped wood out back. It was in the way they existed now, intertwined without needing to define what held them together. Spring arrived in a rush of color. The trees around the ranch bloomed with white flowers, the air thick with the scent of new growth. Lydia spent afternoons on the porch, Grace on her hip, humming softly. Clayton built a small fence around the back garden, repairing the worn edges and adding a new row for sunflowers, because Lydia said she wanted to see something that tall and yellow against the sky. One warm evening, after supper, Clayton returned from the barn with a strange expression on his face. Lydia was rocking Grace in the chair by the window, but when she saw him, she sat upright. "What is it?" He didn't speak at first. He walked to the table, reached into his coat pocket, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Got this in town." She took it with hesitation, unfolded it, and scanned the words. Her heart dropped. It was an official document, a child welfare report. Her name, Grace's name, a request for review of the child's placement, a signature she didn't recognize. Her breath quickened. "What does this mean?" "Someone filed a concern," Clayton said. "Anonymous. Could have been anyone. Someone who saw us in town. Someone who didn't like what they assumed." "Do they think I'm not fit?" "They don't know anything. But they'll come. Probably in a week. Ask questions. Look at the house. You, me, Grace." Lydia stood slowly, cradling her daughter tighter. "What if they try to take her?" "They won't," Clayton said, stepping closer. "I won't let them." Panic gripped her throat. She hadn't felt that kind of fear in months. Not since the day she'd been sold. Not since the night of the storm. The idea of losing Grace, of waking up and finding her crib empty, of hearing someone say she wasn't a real mother, was too much to bear. Clayton touched her shoulder. "I've been thinking about something," he said, "and maybe now's the time." She turned to him, eyes wide. "I want to marry you." The words didn't come out like a proposal. They came out like a promise. Lydia blinked. "Clayton, I'm not asking for tradition. I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not. But if we're married, if we're a legal family, it'll make everything easier. For Grace. For you. And I want it. I've wanted it." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Grace, still asleep in her arms, safe and warm. "I want it too." They married quietly. No guests. No white dress. Just the three of them standing under the cottonwood tree, where Eleanor and the child she never held lay buried. Clayton wore his best shirt, ironed, but still wrinkled. Lydia wore a dress she'd mended herself, with a single ribbon around her waist. Grace was in her arms, dressed in white cotton and pink booties. The sheriff came to officiate. He didn't ask questions. He didn't joke. He just said the words slowly, clearly, with a kind of respect that made Lydia cry halfway through. Clayton said his vows simply. Lydia whispered hers through trembling lips. They kissed once. Just once. But it was enough to seal everything. After, they sat on the porch, hand in hand, Grace sleeping in a basket by their feet. "I didn't think I'd ever do this again," Clayton said. "I didn't think I'd survive long enough to do anything," Lydia replied. He looked at her, his eyes soft. "You're the bravest person I've ever known. You're the kindest." They said nothing more. The child welfare visit came 2 days later. A young woman stepped out of a government car, clipboard in hand, polite but clinical. Lydia stood tall, holding Grace. Clayton stayed beside her, arm just behind her back. The woman walked through the house, asked questions, looked in every room. She made notes. She commented on the safety of the crib, the quality of food in the kitchen, the fire extinguisher near the stove. She smiled at Grace, who stared back with sleepy eyes. She asked about income, about health, about history. Clayton didn't flinch. Lydia answered everything honestly. At the end, the woman stepped outside and looked at the couple. "This child is clearly loved," she said, "and cared for. I see no cause for concern. You'll receive formal confirmation in writing, but as far as I'm concerned, she's right where she belongs." Lydia's knees nearly buckled. Clayton steadied her. After the car disappeared down the road, they sat in silence on the porch. Lydia let herself cry. Long, loud, with her head pressed to Clayton's shoulder. They had passed through fire and come out whole. Later that year, Grace took her first steps. She waddled across the yard, barefoot in the grass, arms raised, mouth open in laughter. Clayton stood a few feet away, arms outstretched, eyes wide with wonder. She stumbled once, caught herself, and reached him. He scooped her up into the air and laughed. A real laugh, deep and full, the kind that made the trees seem to sway in response. Lydia watched from the porch, a hand resting on her belly. She hadn't told him yet, but she would. Soon. There was time now. There was space. There was hope. The ranch was no longer silent. It echoed with new life. And every room, every hallway, every corner of that once hollow house now pulsed with a single, undeniable truth. This was home, and they were a family. In the heart of a lonely ranch once buried in silence and sorrow, love bloomed, not through grand gestures or perfect beginnings, but through quiet courage, unspoken understanding, and the kind of devotion that chooses to stay even when the road is hard. Lydia, Clayton, and little Grace didn't just survive. They became a family built from ashes, stronger than blood and more beautiful than fate. This is more than a story of second chances. It's a reminder that healing doesn't always come from where we expect, but it always comes when we choose love over fear. If stories like this touch your heart and leave you wanting more, then saddle up and hit that subscribe button to join us here on Wild West Love Chronicles. From tales of redemption and romance to gripping journeys across the untamed frontier, there's always another powerful story waiting just around the bend. Don't miss out. Subscribe now and ride with us into the next unforgettable love story.